Thank you so much for having me. It's hard to believe that it's been 2 years since I appeared before you all as a first-time candidate saying I was running for office because of my family's experiences, and as daughter of immigrants, caretaker for my mom, legal guardian for my sisters, I believed that city government was a place to affect change. A year and 5 months into it, I'm absolutely convinced of that now, that from this seemingly tiny perch on the city level and city council, we've been able to do huge things. Quick summary of what's happened over this first term that I've been really proud of. On income inequality, pushing forward on paid parental leave, putting Boston on the short list of cities that offers this 6 weeks of pay to moms and dads, inclusive of every family type. Also on income inequality, pushing forward on wage theft. I had convened a group that included immigrant justice centers, Community Labor United, Chinese Progressive Association. Our language formed the basis of an executive order that Mayor Marty Walsh signed into effect, guaranteeing that contractors will think twice because now there's city teeth attached to those state labor laws. Leveling the playing field for small businesses that are locally owned, neighborhood businesses against big corporations that can afford delay and permitting and waiting for that whole process to play out. The second big topic of fighting discrimination. Was extremely proud to partner with Councilor Ayanna Pressley on an ordinance that guarantees healthcare equity for transgender city employees. We did this even before the state, saying that the city of Boston was going to make sure that we are putting in place protection so that no healthcare company can discriminate based on gender identity. Similarly, on fighting discrimination, I've been convening a working group on language and communications access so that residents and families, you can hear every other accomplishment that happens, so that residents and families from different various language backgrounds or those who need access to assistive technology for the visually or auditory impaired can fully access city services. On the environmental front, led the charge along with Councilor Matt O'Malley on pushing for fossil fuel divestment for the city of Boston. We're still making steps there. And finally, on transparency and good government, I was proud to be one of the first elected officials to step out on the Olympics and say, there's something wrong with this process when there's no transparency, and to keep pushing on that front, noting that it is a gross violation of the Boston City Charter if we are to issue a blank check financial guarantee. I also make sure to put out council notes so that you know everything that happens every week. Much more work to do in the next term with your support and with your vote. Want to focus especially on mental health and more issues around working families. Thank you. I maintain my premise that Boston does not need to host the Olympics to be a great city. And if we are talking about hosting the Olympics in order to get major infrastructure repairs or other investments, let's just do those investments and not have the distraction over the next 9 years that's taking away from conversation about schools and affordable housing and all of the other priorities that will honestly get swept under the rug if we are to focus on this 100%. Now, that being said, I have been a full participant on the City Council's subcommittee on this topic. There is a very tiny window for me where we have the opportunity to prove that Boston could do the Olympics differently from other cities. If you look at past history, the Olympics tends to be associated with huge cost overruns, with gentrification, with displacement. If we were to do it differently, there is the opportunity, you're talking about potential, the opportunity for infrastructure that could be put in place to result in more affordable housing afterwards, for economic development pipelines that will create more pathways for communities of color and low-income residents, to address issues around homelessness and create more funding pockets potentially. However, if we are to believe any of those promises, we need to see it in writing and we need to see the details. I'm an attorney, and so I'm going to be very focused on the specific legal language that will demonstrate that should Boston host the Olympics, we will come out of it as a better city for residents from all backgrounds and all income levels. I am not yet there, and I believe that the bar has to be extremely high for the proponents to meet before I get there. So first and foremost for me is the financial guarantee piece. It would have to be a deviation from the International Olympic Committee's previous practice in saying that we are not going to require a blanket guarantee from city government to cover this. Boston cannot, we have too many things that we need to fund and prioritize. We cannot be diverting precious taxpayer money to fund stadiums and build other Olympic infrastructure. I need to see that coming out of this, there's a plan in place such that once the experience of hosting the Olympics is done, there will be more people who are better off in Boston from all income levels and backgrounds. So that's pathways that ensure all of the economic opportunities around procurement, around contracting, have left more women-owned and minority-owned businesses successfully operating. I want to see concrete proof that as they're talking about affordable housing, that will materialize and stay and be built and be located in neighborhoods across the city. And I also want to see that the land that's being talked about for the potential venues is not putting at risk our small business owners who have worked so hard to build up Wadette Circle and the food manufacturing cluster, for example, or other clusters where residents and businesses have built what's there. They cannot be pushed out, and that land cannot be taken by eminent domain for a stadium or for other infrastructure. It's an issue that we see here in JP, certainly, and in many neighborhoods across the city. I stay awake sometimes thinking about one that's especially near dear to my heart in Chinatown, where the impacts are so concentrated and it's so close to downtown. I think there are a number of strategies. We need to think innovatively about preserving affordable housing and creating new affordable housing. The city, in partnership with other agencies and entities, is already trying a number of different strategies, and I think we need to keep monitoring those and expanding on those. One is around land trusts and trying to replicate what has been seen as successful in areas like Dudley Square, where a community group or a group of residents will actually own the land, own the properties, and residents know that they're going to buy in at a certain level, and they will sell with maybe a little bit of profit, but not at market level, so that that property, when it's transferred, will remain accessible and affordable to families. Out in Allston, Brighton, there's a very interesting partnership happening where Harvard University is funding a line of credit for Allston Brighton CDC, where we are seeing all cash offers, making it such that residents who want to come in and want to buy owner-occupied buildings can't compete with developers. So by offering that line of credit to the nonprofit, they are arming residents who wish to buy and live in the neighborhood with the ability to compete for those offers. They sign an agreement that that property will remain owner-occupied for the period of time that they're living there. There are other strategies as well in terms of city making land available and offering D&D owned or BRA owned plots for affordable housing. I had a great conversation with Michael and the group that he brought in to the city council. We have started doing some research into Washington, D.C.'s program around city-sponsored affordable housing vouchers and putting city money to making sure that we can have those units as well. There have been some strides on that already, and we're pushing for much more. The very basic minimum is transparency. The BRA has made the commitment that they are moving to put all of those agendas online. One big loophole had been previously that when something did appear on the agenda, abutters would receive notification. If it happened to get deferred at that meeting and kicked back to a later month's agenda, that deferral did not result in more abutter notifications. And that was a strategy used by many developers who wanted to avoid that public spotlight. They'd come in, they'd defer, they know that next time around, fewer people would even know to show up. So that commitment has been made that not just the initial notification, but deferrals will be also subject to the same level of public accountability. The agendas will be put online. A lot of the maps and the project status and the notifications and all of that is accessible, but it's a matter of making sure that people know it's there and understand it. So I think what the City Council can do is continue to hold the BRA accountable in providing information and responding to constituent requests. I have always felt that another major step is that each decision should be accompanied by an explanation. If it's approved, why was it approved? If it's denied or deferred, why? Every time a judge makes a decision, they have to issue a short written summary of their reasoning. And if we could have that, it would be an extra layer of accountability for the BRA as well. I do not have that number. So the question was around, do we have a number of how many residents from communities of color have gotten jobs since I've been in office. I had a conversation with Chief John Barros, who's the head of economic development for the city. This was Tuesday afternoon, around some additional funding that his office is getting and what it would go to. That office has responsibility for making sure that residents from all backgrounds, particularly communities of color, have equitable access to jobs. What we've seen in this last year and 5 months is that more emphasis has been put on good paying jobs. So every development construction project that's happening in the neighborhoods needs to fulfill the Boston resident jobs policy requirements of certain percentage Boston residents, certain percentage residents of color. Much more accountability and teeth has been put into tracking that. And any job in the neighborhood, even if it's not necessarily triggering the level that kicks into effect, should be subject to those same requirements as well. The office is also focused on 2 major initiatives. One is marketing Boston so that we are bringing in business from around the country that encourages more participation from communities of color. Surveys done by the Boston Convention Center and other places have shown that Boston's reputation nationally is actually pretty bad. We're pretty down low on the list, rated by residents of color from other cities of where they want to visit, where they want to play. That needs to change. We need to be welcoming. We need to be hosting these conventions and making sure that everybody across the country feels welcome in Boston. The other major area is around putting the funding in for a disparity study. Once we have the numbers in place of exactly what the inequities are and how we can address these disparities, then we'll have the tools to concretely address them. Thank you. This is one of my big priorities following up on the paid parental leave work. Having a baby is one of the leading causes of dipping below the poverty line for families across the United States. You're earlier on in your career, you don't have money saved up that you can take time off work to take care of the baby, and once the baby is at the age where they need childcare, if you can't afford to do that yourself, you don't have a family member who's free to do that, it's the cost of another mortgage or more. I know this very concretely. My new son is now 5.5 months old, and I'm incredibly lucky that we have a daycare center in Boston City Hall that is relatively affordable. There are a couple things that I think we can do at the city level and that we've already started looking into. One is really making sure that we're thinking about childcare and early education as the same thing. So as we push for universal pre-K as it relates to education, we're not just thinking about creating the seats within Boston public schools, but how can we also leverage the community options that are available, the daycare centers, the YMCAs, the even parochial options, and make sure that it is one seamless experience and set of options for residents to choose from, because the more supply there is, then the faster we'll get to the point where it could be affordable. That includes empowering often residents from new small business owners from various backgrounds. Boston Chinatown Neighborhood Center has a program where they will go out and train you to have your own in-home daycare center. They will license you, they'll do all the inspections, they'll make sure that everything is perfect, and then not only are you giving a source of income to often immigrant resident or someone who might not have another opportunity to get into an economic pathway, but you're creating another daycare option. Every new building that goes up in Boston that is for commercial space should be looked at to see, can we site a daycare center there? Can we make sure that parents have that option as they're trying to get back to work? I did not support the pay raise vote. I ran for city council knowing that I was going to do it for a certain salary, and I think the system overall is wrong. And most people, the vast majority of people, do not get the luxury of setting their own salary and deciding how much they should get paid. So until we fix the system where the city councilors get to not only vote on the pay raise, but also pick what number that is, until we change that, I'm not going to be comfortable voting for it. I'd actually proposed a separate proposal along with Councilor Josh Zakem to create an independent commission that would look at comparables and what the salary should be and take that out of the city council's hands. I spent the first 3 or 4 months of my term going around and visiting every single emergency shelter that I could in the city. It was something that came up on the campaign trail a whole lot as I was standing outside transportation hubs and other places, and men and women experiencing homelessness would come up and say how hard it was to find a bed for the night and how hard it was to keep their health intact as they were experiencing the shelter system. I would say first and foremost, we need to be focusing on housing rather than how to preserve emergency shelter and overnight options. The Pine Street Inn has shown incredible success in moving to a model where now over 50% of their beds are transitional housing and not emergency shelter. If we can get people into stable living situations, then we don't need to worry about how to keep them day to day in and out of shelter and bust around and in the lottery system and all of that. It's a model that other cities have seen work as well, and I think the focus first and foremost should be on making sure we're pushing towards transitional housing. So that being said, to get from here to there, there's still a lot of work to do. Our systems, if you speak with any of the heads of emergency shelters across the city, they will tell you that it's not just about housing. It's about mental health, it's about substance abuse. There's a whole set of issues that we need to think about in terms of providing services for those who are experiencing homelessness. I think particularly for families and particularly for women, it's also about safety and feeling that the shelter, if you must, or the stable housing situation is one where they can take their family and they can trust that they'll be taken care of. Another population that wasn't mentioned in George's question, but that I have talked about a lot and heard about a lot and called a hearing on earlier in the term, is around youth. LGBTQ youth make up an incredibly disproportionate percentage of the population that's homeless, and because of safety issues and concerns, are not always even seeking shelter, but are choosing to stay on the street. So we have a lot of work to do, but it's a big priority of mine. Cool. Great. So absolutely on that second point. On the first point, as a former small business owner, this is a huge passion of mine. And thank you for bringing up small business as a progressive issue. People often think about, when I talk about streamlining processes and cutting bureaucracy, people think, okay, well, that's not necessarily a progressive policy. But at the end of the day, when you have a complicated system, the people making it through the process are the ones with a lot of resources and who can hire that army of consultants and attorneys to get them through. We want to support the neighborhood local businesses. So first, there are resources that are available, and often those people don't know about them. We need to do a better job of spreading the word. Mass Growth Capital is a state-based industry agency that provides financing for businesses that might not be able to get bank financing otherwise. They particularly target women-owned businesses and businesses owned by people of color to provide that gap for growth or for expanding your business or for launching that next branch. If we can connect more businesses to that access to capital, I think that's step number one. Step number two is making sure that the zoning and the actual underlying regulations in place are conducive to these businesses starting up. Many of the neighborhoods in Boston, well, all of the neighborhoods in Boston have a different variation of the zoning code applied to them. And many of them, it's very hard to open businesses. You'll go to the zoning code and it'll say either accepted or allowed, conditional, or forbidden based on each specific use. And in Roxbury, for example, once you cross over from the south end to Roxbury across Mass Ave, the number of allowed uses and even conditional uses drops sharply. And that's a big part of why businesses aren't open on this side of Mass Ave, is because it takes incredibly long to get them open. So we need to cut down on those times. The city has started to streamline the zoning code and make some uses allowable across the board. There's much more work to do, and I'll just add the amount of time. So the final piece is that we need to really think about anchoring local businesses and not keeping out, but protecting local businesses when large national chains want to come in and have more resources to take the same spaces. The council as a whole has been pushing for this extremely hard, and it's come up at hearing after hearing and meeting after meeting. The response that we've gotten is that the state will refuse to license recovery programs that are not accessible by car or ambulance, really, that if something should happen in the middle of the night, they don't trust that a ferry would be an adequate way of getting to emergency services. So I think that asterisk aside, if there's a way to work out that issue and make sure that, again, should there be need for emergency medical services, whether it's posting something right on that campus or having some other means of accessing medical services somewhere else, that does need to be resolved, and that is an important consideration. In terms of reopening the island and creating a campus there, I think for me, again, it's about how are we using the money that we are saving, or that we could be saving, and diverting to things like a city-sponsored voucher program to focus on housing versus homelessness. Recovery is incredibly important, and we need to make sure that that anybody across the city and really across the state that needs access to these services can get treatment on demand. There is actually currently a proposal before the council now to create a dedicated funding stream for recovery, and the Office of Recovery is in the midst of being set up and developed. So I think there is much more to come on that front, and it's a priority of the administration and of the council. I am open to thinking more about using a ferry, but I would need, again, to get over that hurdle of how do we make sure that emergency medical services are accessible to. I would definitely support it. I know that most of the major cities are at about 1%, and it's a tension, right? Because I wish that we could add an additional 3% in terms of the revenue side and creating more resources for open space and affordable housing and all of that. But the 3% does come on the backs of residents, so it's a balance. So I would be absolutely comfortable supporting a 1% addition for the Community Preservation Act, open to talking about a different amount. I do think that affordable housing is a huge priority, and that would be an important funding stream for that. I do think there are set-asides also so that open space does need to be funded, and a certain amount does need to go to other causes as well. But again, interested in moving that forward.
All right, great. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Thank you, Councilor.
Thank you.